And welcome back to Inside Olympia. Giving tenants more rights has become something of a bipartisan issue in the state legislature. The idea is that fewer evictions is good for both tenants and landlords. But what does striking the right balance look like? And what ideas are on the table for finding new dollars for more affordable housing in Washington? Joining me now is Democratic State Representative Nicole Marci, who has a background in low-income housing and homelessness, and Republican State Representative Andrew-Barkis, who is a longtime landlord. Welcome both of you to Inside Olympia. Good to see you.
Thank you.
And let me just hear more about your backgrounds and kind of where you're coming from as you think about this issue. You've, for many years, Representative Marci, been with the Downtown Emergency Services Center, been working with the very people who are without homes.
Indeed. So not only advocating for people to find homes, but also providing homes, both as a landlord in my job to about 1,300 formerly homeless individuals in the Seattle area living with serious medical conditions and mental illnesses, as well as partnering with dozens of landlords in the metro area to support tenants in housing, usually using rental subsidies.
Okay, so in some ways, you point out that landlords aren't all the same. In some ways, you are a landlord.
Indeed, it's a different context than a private,
yeah.
But certainly understand the day-to-day of operating apartment buildings.
Right, and you were had a career, if I read correctly, in the military and got injured and then ended up in...
Well, thank you, yes. So
managing an apartment building.
It was an interesting pathway into the business 28 years ago. Going to Seattle University, I was in the ROTC and had a path to becoming an officer, and injured my knee a couple weeks before the last phase of my training and lost my commission in 1990. And I was managing a little apartment building, and the gentleman who owned it came up to me one day and says, "What's your plans?" I said, "Well, I need to find a job." And he says, "Well, I own a lot of apartment buildings in Seattle," and that's how it started. And so, painting and plumbing and doing all the work that goes along with that. And went from Seattle to Spokane, worked for a large firm there doing commercial and residential and association management back here in '96, and started with a little company that I ended up buying here about 13 years ago. And we manage about 1,200 single-family homes through Thurston and Pierce County. So I've been in the industry for well over 25 years, doing property management.
Well, what's interesting is if you think about the legislature and if you think about trending topics like Twitter does, it changes from year to year, and certainly this year, one of the larger bubbles, if you looked at the trending map for this session, would be around certainly housing and homelessness, but specifically around landlord and tenant issues and tenant rights, which is just, suddenly I'm kind of thinking, why am I hearing so much about this year? What happened? Was there a tipping point? Because maybe you were talking about it last year, but I wasn't hearing about it. This year I'm hearing about it. So do you have a sense of what changed?
Well, I've had the same thing, Austin. I think the day that I walked in, we walked in the same time frame and met immediately and went, wow, we've got experience that we can start working on these issues, and we immediately jumped into that. First with the squatters bill, I think we did, and then last year bringing a successful culmination to source of income, which had been on the radar for about 6 years. They have been working on this particular policy. So both our backgrounds really brought that together. But then this year, I asked, and we found out that the next thing on the radar was eviction and eviction reform. There has been a lot of movement coming out of the north, out of Seattle and King County especially, regarding landlord-tenant law and policy, and it's just one thing after the next. And in our industry, we're kind of waiting for the next thing. So I am curious a little bit about the strong push on it, and of course the drawing of the nexus between eviction to homelessness, and there's a very coordinated message there that we keep seeing. But both of us wanted to get out in front of this, and that's why we started to develop the policy that we did early on before session started.
Yeah, and of course there was this story in the Seattle Times about just before session, I think, about the person who was in the hospital who was facing eviction, owed, I think, just $2. A story like that can also kind of have an impact on how people are thinking about this. But from your perspective, what was the tipping point? Why are we suddenly talking about this in
Yeah.
such a big way?
I think there are a few different reasons. One is I think legislators around the state are hearing more and more about the high cost of housing and how that's impacting residents in small towns and big cities. And we know in the Puget Sound region, for example, in the last 7 or 8 years, average rents have gone from $1,000 a month to over $1,700 a month. And that is equal to about $8,000 in annual new expense for renters. And we know that home prices as well have increased. So that pressure on folks, I think, has brought this issue to the forefront. I think nationally as well, there's been a lot more understanding about the impact of evictions. That was in part driven by the research and writing of Dr. Matthew Desmond, who's the author of the book Evicted, he's a researcher at Princeton University who has also collected data from all 50 states about the impacts of eviction. While we once understood eviction to be really an outcome of poverty, the data that Dr. Desmond has worked on has helped us to better understand that eviction really can be a driver of long-term poverty, because when people are displaced from housing, it's difficult to get back into housing. It disconnects kids from their schools and parents from their jobs. And so I think as part of an overall strategy to address the housing crisis, the understanding around the impacts of eviction
So
has
what you're
grown.
describing is that eviction can sort of be the beginning of a downward spiral. Landlords don't like eviction either, in theory.
No, I mean, and I can tell you, Austin, and it is interesting because, again, I've a broad spectrum, a lot of years, working in all sorts of aspects all throughout the state. Landlords do not like eviction. It's the last resort. And what I think part of the conversation we're missing is the causation. So, it's focused on the financial piece, but there are also many other secondary causes. So if we go out and we ask and we draw this correlation between, this person was evicted, now they're homeless. I bet you if we go talk to the person who's now on the street and we find out that they have an addiction problem or they have a something else happened along the way that caused them, drugs, the money was spent elsewhere, they weren't paying the rent. So landlords have no other option but to take the course of action. The word eviction is, I think, used a lot broader than it used to be. We hear it all the time, and I'm always reminding people, no, landlords can't evict anybody. The courts do the eviction. Landlords have to deal with the problem, the situation. And so we use whatever tools are at our disposal to do that. But as a landlord, I've rented, last year we rented hundreds and hundreds of homes. I think we had 2 evictions, Austin. I mean, we don't see this as a common situation, and I have sampled throughout the entire area, of course, with our agencies and everything else looking at that. So we look at it a little differently. We want to make a better process, and we both agree on that and how we do that. But there's a lot of other pieces I think we're missing, and one of the other key pieces is we have a much different political climate, and so sometimes that political capital pushes policy, of course, and that's the big push right now on this. From various organizations that are really making this come to the forefront.
So part of what I hear you saying is that Democrats have bigger majorities. You can do a lot of this landlord-tenant, these bills, without the votes of Republicans, or you can kind of find that bipartisan compromise and get bipartisan votes out of this. We haven't seen the end of the movie yet, but let's talk about some of the changes that are on the table. And a lot of it has to do with just the notice people get. And it seems like some of the differences are just about how many days. Is it 3 or 5 or 14? Or but what when you think about, what you think is optimal policy here in terms of giving tenants a little more time before they face eviction?
Right.
What seems like the sweet spot to you?
Yeah, so what we're talking about right now is going from a 3-day, what's known as unlawful detainer, or and commonly called the pay or vacate notice, to a 14-day. That is currently where the eviction bills stand, and looking at policies around the country where policies that some other states have, looking at some practices that we've seen here in Washington State, there is some evidence to show that is a good amount of time. allows people, if they have fallen behind, to get that next paycheck to make up. That a 14-day notice isn't going to solve all of the problems that Representative Barkis refers to, but it will solve problems for those folks who, because of the increase in the cost of housing, stumble, like we all do, and fall behind.
So 14 days?
Too much.
Too much. How
Yeah.
come?
Well, from the perspective of, in a classic situation, and again, if it is legitimate financial concerns and the tenant is coming to the landlord, most landlords will work with that tenant, trying to figure out what needs to be done. So we did know that it was really going to center around the pay or vacate notice. So I did the same thing. I talked to both the housing alliances and the landlords, and then we looked at data. Our data said that 41 states in the country were between 0 and 7 days. So we decided on 5, a 60% increase, and we said, what really was it? 2 extra days allowed somebody to get access to the resources. And if we're talking $2, Austin, or $100, or a very short period, not necessarily a paycheck, but maybe just a little bit, how do we get them that access? How do we get them into those services? Now, we started at 5. Of course, we started talking, Representative Macri started at 21 days. We came back with 7. Now I've heard 10. But I can tell you from the landlord perspective that I know we're focusing on the small percentage that is really the problem, but in the greater scheme of things, for those who are not good tenants, taking that extra time and now on the landlord's perspective, you have 14 days plus a time of court. There's a perspective that a landlord who has a mortgage payment to make is now waiting 30, possibly 60, possibly longer, especially if they've tried to work with that tenant before they even went to that process. We get people come to us all the time that they're 90 days in the hole. They haven't seen rent in forever before we even start the process. And that has great impact on the landlords also, inability to pay and everything else. So I think that is kind of the sweet spot that we're trying to find, but it's much more difficult to negotiate, more so than it was last year. Last year we were so close that really there was that will to get there. And so now we're looking at that kind of the impending prospect of seeing that it becomes 14 days. Which is
so much of this is like that narrative, what is the landlord's experience? What is the tenant's experience? And so this idea that, look, these landlords have their mortgages to pay. They may have given somebody quite a lot of opportunity to pay up, and now it's time to go.
Right, and so for those who have given lots of opportunity, this shouldn't impact. And for the people, I've talked to many small mom and pop type landlords from my district and around the state who say, well, I've done one legal eviction in the 30 years that I've rented out my house. And so these changes won't necessarily impact folks who haven't run into these sorts of challenges. But what we know is that there's really no other process where a family can lose something so critical to their survival in such a short amount of time. So this isn't talking about changing the fact that that tenants need to pay their rent, and landlords should have the right to be able to collect on the rent. This is talking about how quickly people lose their homes and what's the impact of that. We know we've worked on other issues around vital services and where people fall behind, issues like medical debt or foreclosure. And we know that people are not going to be prohibited from going to the doctor if they fall behind on their medical bills, and that it takes 190 days for a non-judicial foreclosure for people to lose possession of their homes. And we contrast that with the short amount of time that tenants have when they fall behind. And the way the law is, as you said, it could be as little as $2. Now that's an extreme example, but that is what the statute currently supports.
Yes, but there are other components, of course, and when this is a model that we talk about, these are private-owned properties. Some are government. And that's kind of some of the differences too that we look at. That some of these things are very applicable within the government realm of housing model, but in the private sector makes up the bulk of the rentals that are in our state and throughout our country, and these are owned, there's property rights, there's all these different things in that contractual relationship that we work on. So although it can be compared, an example, to foreclosure and some of these other things, it's different. It is different in the relationship that's there. And so we do agree that this is an amazing impact on people, but we also, as you've talked about in your other shows, just people that just left, it's supply. I mean, we get at what are some of the other causations? Is it really the eviction that's causing this, that's putting these pressures? Or is it the fact that our policies have created such an environment that's so difficult to build that we have a lack of supply, which has driven our costs up? So, this is one piece of many that are, there's a wholesale rewrite of the landlord-tenant law kind of happening through a lot of policy going on.
Well, and maybe that's a good opportunity to step back and sort of say, that it's not just about landlord-tenant issues or rights. There's this whole idea of just, should we revise the real estate excise tax, and would that free up money that could then be used for affordable housing? Are there other things you can do to build more capacity? So as you're thinking about the problem, maybe stepping back a little bit from this direct issue.
Yeah, and I know you talked with folks from the Senate about some of the strategies, and it's true that eviction reform, I consider it an anti-displacement strategy that is one piece. The Democrats have come out with a package, I think, of over 35 bills related to expanding access to affordable housing, both through direct state support for our lowest income residents, but also in ensuring that the private market can produce more. I agree wholeheartedly that supply is a big issue, and I have been working with my colleagues, including Representative Fitzgibbon, who has a bill to really drive density in cities and towns where we have already invested in infrastructure like transit, and removing some of the impediments to building housing, like slow permitting or financing opportunities for truly affordable housing. Things like looking at accessory dwelling units, how we build density in a variety of neighborhoods and towns and cities across the state. So there's a whole package that looks at building more, building better, and building stability, because we can't keep saying once we build the supply, problems will go away. I hear from constituents every single week about the struggles that they have in the housing that they operate. And I'll say, I've been to eviction court, both as a landlord. I get it. Sometimes things don't work out, and tenants need to leave. But also, I sat through several hours at the eviction court in Seattle and saw people come through who had stumbled. A woman who had a medical crisis, had been out of work for 3 weeks, fell behind on her rent, and her only option was there in eviction court to turn over the keys to her landlord, say, I'll live out of my car and go to work tomorrow morning.
Millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars have been allocated and spent in Seattle and King County on this issue over the last 10 years. And the problem continues to get worse. So it tells me that we have some policy issues. Representative Macri mentioned many bills. I'm co-sponsoring most of those bills with my Democrat counterparts. The ADU bill, the condo liability bill. I'm working on an ecology bill with Representative Peterson on getting more land available. All are good potential moves, but in the minority, we're not the ones coming out with the big package of bills, although we have, and we have presented many alternatives and solutions to say this is an alternative. These are some other things, as is evident by the bills I'm working on. But we've also been doing this for years and years and years. We've been saying this is a problem. These regulations, these costs, these drivers are a problem that are going to get worse, and they have. And so it's great to see the acknowledgement now that maybe we can do some of these different things. But we're 400,000 plus units. So I would say that supply, it is a huge factor as growth continues, and everything comes along those lines. Plus, going back to, I too have spent time in court in trying to work these things out. It is unfortunate that person who's sitting there that Representative Macri observed was unable to find the access to the funds that are there. And I hear on the other side, well, they're just not there. Well, I know that Representative Macri and I worked on a great bill last year to increase the dock recording fee, self-imposed upon the real estate industry, to put a permanent funding source into place to get money right to the problem at the local level. And we even made sure it was at the local level. So there's a disconnect there, and that's why both our bills have education components in them. Both say, you know, how do we get people the access to the resources they need, and that's very important. But it is a holistic approach, and you know what I've suggested, and I think that what would be a better approach to this is if we want to focus on one piece of policy that's really able to be moved during this. But really, if we're talking about a wholesale rewrite of the landlord-tenant law, it's been since I think 2008 when it was last done. We should get a task force together. We should get people together collaboratively in a good environment. It's very difficult right now to do these stakeholder meetings and put a room of 40 people together, and it's just very difficult.
Well, and you raise an interesting, I have just the slightest kind of knowledge about San Francisco as an example of a city, obviously, that has exorbitant housing prices and a lot of tensions around landlord-tenant issues, and there are certainly those in San Francisco who feel like the pendulum is swung too far in favor of the tenants. And I just wonder if you've thought about the potential for sort of a war, right, between landlords and tenants, and where things get to the point that it's just very hostile and difficult. And is there a Washington way to do this where both sides do come together and you can get to where you need to be, but you haven't created this situation where everybody's in an adversarial position?
I would say, I think just even listening to Representative Barkis, there's more agreement than disagreement, and that's what the legislative process brings out, is how do we come to agreement in those places where there is tension. It is definitely challenging to do the stakeholder work and make sure you're listening to all the voices, but we're both committed to that. That's what we have been doing. And I would argue that the urgency is real. So it is a luxury for us as policymakers to say, let's study it more, let's do a task force, let's see where we can get. And the legislative process pushes us naturally into that direction. I feel compelled to bring the urgency I'm hearing, not only from my constituents, but I've traveled the state and talked to folks in Bellingham and Spokane, Vancouver, Ellensburg, Olympia, who are all telling me that they are having the same challenges with housing stability right now.
And I would, a couple things real quick. Yes, there is the potential, because it is driving that. And what's happening is the extremes. And even for Representative Macri, the extremes on her end of the spectrum, like mine, push, right? So that's probably how we got to 21 days to start. To bring the landlords together and get them in my office and say, I want to develop policy that's proactive, that's a first, because they're so used to fighting. The other thing is, to the sense of urgency, Seattle's been doing this, King County's been doing this, Tacoma, they're all doing their own policies to address these issues. We're just starting to look at it from the state. So although I do agree that there's this urgency, I do believe that, again, in order to get good policy, you have to take that time. Source of income took years to get to the point where it was a good piece of policy that works for both sides. Seattle is very much parallel to San Francisco and other communities. And we're seeing that, and it is reaching that tipping point. We're losing landlords, and contrary to some arguments that say, oh, that's not really, the stats don't lie. We are losing, I see it daily, we're losing people out of the business, and that is impacting our existing supply, which is already tight enough as it is. So if we keep putting the burden of regulation and all these mandates and all this stuff on a broad base, we're going to continue to see many landlords leaving the business, and it's just going to make it harder for us to do the job that we want to do and need to do.
That's important data to look at. We know that since the recession and the foreclosure crisis, that more people are renting today than in the early 2000s. It may be true that we have fewer landlords, but we definitely have more renters in the state. Close to 40% of all Washington residents are renters. So it certainly is an issue of, I think, that warrants legislative attention.
And it's the makeup of what's been built too. If you look at the building in Seattle, the majority of the things that were built downtown, everybody says, oh, we have all these units. Well, those are apartments being built, so that's part of the condo piece. But that has put that on there. But as far as those managing the build, we're losing that, and we will continue to see that.
Just a couple minutes left. There was this other issue, a high profile in Tacoma, where there was a building that was being converted and tenants, low-income tenants, being evicted. I know that there's some talk about trying to build in some protections, some notice.
Yeah, there's where we have a lot of agreement.
That's actually the one bill.
We'll end on a note of agreement. Okay.
It was. I put forth a package of 4 eviction prevention bills, very similar, and we actually talked quite a bit during the interim of where we were coming from. And one of the things that we very much agreed on is 120 days, or extending the notification process when there's going to be a significant remodel or repurposing of a building, giving a 20-day notice.
That's the current?
That is the current. And it was done legally, and the new property owner had every right to do that with their property. Yeah. But the impact was huge. And so both of us have felt that if we can give that additional time for people to find additional housing, especially in this tight market, that was very important. That was one of my bills that actually made it out of exec and is now kind of floating around as a vehicle, although it's incorporated into a lot of bills. So.
Yeah. So, and just on that point, is there one other thing you think, I mean, maybe the ending note that I want to know, just because you are representing the majority party, some issues, there's sort of an agreement that you can't move forward without bipartisan support on. Other issues, the view of the majority is we can move forward, and we will move forward kind of unilaterally. Is this one?
I think this is an area where we have demonstrated we can come to bipartisan agreement. That's not always true with every issue, so we are striving towards that. We're balancing that with the urgency of the issue and what we're hearing from constituents about the need to address this truly statewide affordable housing crisis. But we're at the table. We're meeting again tonight to talk through these policies and see where we can find common ground.
How optimistic are you can get to a yes?
Well, political capital, political pressure doesn't always equal good policy again, and I think that I'm optimistic, but we're getting a little further. There's so many other pieces to this, and the time frame on there, and we'll have policy at the end of the day because the votes are there to have that policy. We're going to continue to push and to be part of the process, and hopefully be considered in the final outcome. So I'm always optimistic. I mean, you have to be in this job, but it's a lot tougher from my perspective. So,
okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, we'll stop it there. State Representatives Nicole Marci, Andrew-Barkis, thank you both for coming in to talk about this important issue. We appreciate it very much. Thank you for watching Inside Olympia. We will see you again next week.